he photographed UFOs. He actually photographed a UFO over Dulce, New Mexico.
But how can I have faith in what you're telling me if I know that you lied to Paul Bennewitz?
I didn't lie to Paul Bennewitz. I had a job to do. I wasn't a maverick. I just didn't go out and do this on my own. My supervisors told me, listen, we don't want him to go out to the public, go on camera and say, hey, I just tapped into a secret laser on Kirtland Air Force Base. Obviously, we can't have that happen. So all I had to do was say, well, you know what, Paul? Maybe what you did see was UFOs.
In the late spring of 1979 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, former Apollo 17 astronaut and Senator Harrison Schmitt held a conference where Officer Gabe Valdez was a guest speaker, discussing the issue of cattle mutilations. Allegedly, after finishing his speech, a man had approached him and handed him a business card, mentioning that he had owned a company that specifically developed, maintained, and sold ultra-sensitive humidity sensors to the military. Additionally, the man mentioned that he had been intrigued by Gabe's portion of the speech that involved the strange lights, unknown craft, and unmarked helicopters that were being discussed. It wasn't just Gabe seeing things, though. The entirety of Dulce would see lights and different craft hovering and flying over Mundo Ridge as well as Mount Archuleta. Regardless, the man had told Gabe that he had discovered something after doing his own research that he believed Gabe would find very interesting. This man was, of course, Paul Bennewitz. From Paul's perspective, though, following where he lived in Albuquerque outside of Kirtland Air Force Base, he described seeing strange lights on a nearly nightly basis while staying outside with his wife. And he'd reportedly watched them fly around Manzano Test Range for a while and then observed these lights eventually fly off quietly towards Coyote Canyon, where Sandia National Laboratory and Phillips Laboratory are both located. But what's important to note is that they are sites that conduct top secret military research. Paul became so fascinated by the lights and craft that he began taking extensive video footage and photos of the strange things he was seeing. This commitment to documenting and tracing back what he saw had unknowingly given Paul Bennewitz some of the longest documented evidence on advanced experimental aircraft, or UAP research, that anyone would ever acquire as a private citizen. But try finding any of that footage yourself online through open sources, and I almost guarantee you that it's unattainable. Something that came to my repeated attention as I was conducting my research was when authors like Greg Valdez and Greg Bishop highlighted the importance of Paul's notes and drawings of the different crafts he observed. The notes would discuss how these crafts operated. More specifically, though, they thoroughly explained what was being visually seen in the various photographs and films through sketched annotated diagrams, maps, and paragraphed captions. What was undeniably special about Paul Bennewitz was that he was able to decipher a litany of classified projects from afar without ever seeing a file up close, or being whispered some unspoken truths by someone in the know. In short, Paul Bennewitz was one of the few who actually bore witness to modern-day magic for himself and studied it so much on so many occasions that he was then able to technically break down the veil of magic and seriously comprehend the technology that was flying in the distance. As I've mentioned before, not only did he witness these crafts on his own, but Bennewitz was also shown them by people suspected of working for entities like the Air Force Office of Special Investigations and some sect of the Army, allegedly. But I assure you that there were and still are so many entities involved in this field of research. The suspected AFOSI agents who revealed a significant amount of classified information to Paul were thought to be Colonel Ernest Edwards and, more importantly, Special Agent Richard Doty. Others who weren't involved with the Air Force had also been recruited by Doty, such as Bill Moore, the author of the first prominent book discussing what allegedly happened with the Roswell incident, and more than likely John Lear as well. Bill was used to spread disinformation to Paul about aliens, and in turn he would end up receiving some of the classified information on UFO technology and projects that he was promised. In saying this, I would like to remind you that Bill Moore's part in the story played more of a sacrificial role in the disinformation campaign against Bennewitz than others like John Lear or Bill McGarity. Moore would be used similarly to Paul by shadowy entities within the government that believed that they were the puppet masters to people's lives who were employed under them. These people associated with Moore and Lear believed that they could closely control the actions and thoughts of anyone who became too interested in the UFO subject and too close to the answers found within the carcasses of so many dead cattle. These men alone would end up causing Paul a substantial amount of psychological trauma due to the fantastical stories and bizarre information that was leaked to him. They would make up this facade that numerous races of aliens were the primary wielders of this technology and were cooperating with portions of the government to allow them to abduct people and mutilate livestock. Many of you may already know this portion of the story and recognize that the entity we're discussing is also tied to the Majestic 12 military cabal and allegedly fake documents that were being dispersed around the time this story really began to escalate. Even if you never got the opportunity to read the MJ-12 documents, you still might have seen something about them, especially since they were virtually broadcasted on television for everyone to see during the 80s and were openly discussed in interviews by people like John Lear and George Knapp. Many of the stories that sparked from the documents and were circulated by those who chirped in the aviary bore eerie similarities to those stories that culminated through others like Paul Bennewitz, Charles Hall, Amaury Rivera, and Bob Lazar, just to name a few. Perhaps one of the only outliers that we'll discuss in relation to government operations within the United States is Dr. Charles A. Hall. But we will discuss his part in the story later once we get into the topic of underground bases. Before you roll your eyes or cast judgment, let's not forget that prior to Bennewitz being inundated with an overflow of fantastical stories that a shadowy portion of the government was working alongside aliens underground, Paul was well ahead of the curve regarding his understanding of the technology and physics he was recording. This was well before Ernest Edwards and Richard Doty had entered the frame of the story and gave Paul Bennewitz classified information about the aircraft and supposed base. Aside from the film, photos, and notes of the crafts Paul took, he was excited to show Gabe Valdez an invention he produced. This instrument Paul created was able to track the presence of these secretive aircrafts in the area through its frequency. Once the frequency became stronger, Bennewitz would be able to record his films while also being able to communicate with these beings on a certain frequency, allegedly. In Paul's first round of letters to the Air Force, he managed to obtain a meeting with a group of people who were employed at Kirtland, along with people who worked at the nearby national laboratories. It's also believed that at least one agent from the National Security Agency or Defense Intelligence Agency had also attended this meeting. The DIA is essentially the Army's version of the CIA, if you're curious. Yet, for those of you who didn't know, it was a running joke for many years during the Cold War to refer to the NSA as no such agency by those employed and politicians in the know. This was mostly due to the fact that the National Security Agency was basically an open secret to everyone in the federal government, yet its existence was officially unacknowledged for some time during its early days. It is an intelligence club that no one else is in or could think of being in unless you are one of the few that's invited. But be careful, since there appears to be a pattern emerging where most who are deemed as short-term assets for the intelligence community do not live long and happy lives for themselves after the fact. It's just something I've noticed. Paul didn't know this at the time, but he had invited some of the most high-ranking scientists, agents, and generals into his home to make the case about the national security concerns of these craft. Apparently, many of the people who attended this meeting at Paul's house were very interested in what he was working on and filming. Yet, As the presentation continued, it was reported that people would start to slowly trickle out as they grew to understand that what Paul was filming and listening to had nothing to do with their personal secret programs at the labs and base. By the end of the presentation, when Paul really began delving into the alien aspects of his national security concerns, only a few people of the original crowd had remained. One of the men who worked at the nearby labs was Dr. Robert Fugate, and it was reported by Greg Bishop that he had stayed for the entire presentation and had a particular vested interest in Paul's work, along with the device he invented. According to Greg Bishop, Dr. Fugate allegedly had been so interested in what he saw during the meeting that it was purported by Paul that the doctor had broken into his house to secretly assess his equipment further. Allegedly. Ultimately, this frequency listening device is what caught the attention of the National Security Agency along with the Defense Intelligence Agency, which at the time also had embedded agents in operations held at Kirtland Air Force Base. Aside from his persistence in speaking what he perceived as true about everything, the at-home laboratory invention of his was the main reason why the Central Intelligence Agency, DIA, NSA, and the AFOSI decided to escalate their surveillance methods and psychological operations against Paul Bennewitz. One thing you must comprehend is how difficult it was to capture some of these experimental aircraft on film, as they were able to generate active camouflage in the 70s and 80s to avoid being seen by the naked eye. That's without even mentioning the incredible speeds and G-forces that these crafts were able to produce, which is why taking a clear shot of one without the aid of a frequency device, moving at speeds that would normally break the sound barrier, as a photographer, could prove to be quite challenging even for the best cameraman. In some instances, the craft is completely silent or is only identified in the area when a low humming noise is produced and likened to the sound of a small lawnmower. As I mentioned a moment ago, after the Air Force, DIA, and NSA caught wind of Paul's homemade listening device, they decided to mess with Paul's psyche. So the agency had purchased a house across the street from him to continue close surveillance. When Paul thought he was speaking to aliens on the other side of his instrument, and the aliens were telling him that they were originally from the Zeta Reticuli star system, along with a bunch of other wild things, it was actually Paul just talking to the NSA in a house on the other side of the street, communicating back with him on a computer. One person who greatly influenced Paul Bennewitz's downward spiraling, whether she intended it or not, was referred to him by none other than Officer Valdez. Myrna Hansen had originally approached Valdez with her story, but he thought it would be something that Paul would find more interesting since he was a big believer in aliens and their alleged involvement in New Mexico. He was encouraged to seek hypnotic regression therapy sessions with the single mother and, at one point, her son as well, to better understand what happened on that mysterious night of hers. Leo Sprinkle was the first hypnotist to interact with Paul and Myrna, and he would be one of the first to witness the downward spiral that Paul would undergo in just the short time that they would work together. In the first session, the three of them were able to conduct a successful hypnotic session where Myrna described driving home from out of state with her son. In her vision, she was described seeing a craft off the side of the road interacting with some cattle. Allegedly, and take this with a grain of salt, she had seen this craft pick up an unsuspecting cow with what she described to be as a tractor beam and had pulled over to get a better look at the cow screaming and unable to move while it was being sucked up into the craft. She had also described stepping out of the car and being bi-consciously aware of what was occurring on the craft without physically being on the ship, and said that she had seen the cow was pinned up inside the craft and ready for surgical operation. Additionally, at some point during these long and rigorous sessions, after unceremoniously cutting ties with Leo Sprinkle, Myrna had described being abducted herself and taken to an underground facility where other alien species were located and worked alongside the military. Now do you see where some of these wild stories of aliens may have originated? The reason I said they had a successful session facetiously is that it seemed like she went straight into her story after shutting her eyes. Hardly any direction was given to her by the hypnotist, and little to no warm-up subconscious exercises were done for her to be so comfortable in a hypnotic state, especially when considering that this was the first time she had ever done anything like that, which to me is indicative that she wasn't taking the hypnosis exercise seriously and was likely just telling Paul an interesting story that she might have very well just created. The mental degradation of Paul after this first session was shocking, and the way that Miss Hansen followed suit in his fear and paranoia was tragic. It was obvious to authors like Greg Bishop and Greg Valdez that these aliens Paul thought he had been communicating with the entire time had begun to turn on him and threaten his life. This was on top of the already very real, intimate pressure that the NSA and others were laying on Paul. Just a few months after their first major hypnotic session, Paul had completely changed to be highly suspicious and overly paranoid. Clearly, he was spiraling. Bennewitz was reported to have hesitantly answered the door to Mr. Sprinkle on the second session, carrying a rifle in his hand and having a pistol holstered on his side. Worryingly, Paul had quickly started to ramble on to Sprinkle about how the aliens could invade through the walls of his home at any minute. Unlike the first session, the second was very short-lived with Paul, and it almost seemed as if he had even become suspicious of Mr. Sprinkle, booting him out of his residence with zero small talk between the men as to why Paul wanted to conclude the session. And keep in mind that this was not long after the hypnotic session even began. After working alongside Leo Sprinkle, he had decided to switch hypnotists to another well-known individual who specialized in alien abduction hypnotic regressive therapy by the name of James Harder. According to people like Greg Bishop, Harder had worked with Myrna Hansen and Paul Bennewitz for some time and was the person who was present when Miss Hansen described being taken to this alleged underground facility. This entire situation with the hypnotic sessions had escalated to heights that I don't even think anyone could have predicted, especially Gabe Valdez. Paul had fully committed to the tinfoil hat persona regarding these sessions, claiming that one of the best locations to conduct a session would be in a car that's parked in a garage and wrapped with 3 layers of barbecue-grade aluminum foil, and to ensure that the top of the vehicle was also wrapped as well. He also claimed that the best location would ideally be in an X-ray room, as the lead encasing the room would protect them during the sessions from external forces attempting to alter the brain. I'm not kidding. Paul believed that the aliens were coming after him physically and psychologically. Towards the end of his sessions with James Harder, Paul started to think that Myrna was the key to this whole story, and that the aliens would do anything in order to take Myrna for themselves. Paul Bennewitz would end up documenting many of his thoughts and opinions on this entire story, and he believed that an alien invasion of the planet was imminent after a deal between the aliens and the US government went sour. He would compile these beliefs in a hefty document that Paul titled Project Beta, and much of his notes can be found throughout Greg Bishop's book if you're interested in reading them. Instead of remaining gripped in pure amazement at the aircraft and experiments that he was observing, Paul had gotten caught up in the assumption that the crafts and lights he was documenting were of alien origin with extraterrestrial operators. For Paul, they appeared to be a national security threat, especially when compiling that he genuinely thought that they were threatening him and believed that these crafts were flying around with impunity that close to the aforementioned labs and Air Force Base. This was when Paul had begun his venture down the rabbit hole and started contacting public officials and anyone at Kirtland Air Force Base who would listen to him. You have to understand that Paul became so concerned that he even wrote a letter to the President of the United States at the time, Ronald Reagan, about this perceived issue. And it was around this time that New Mexico Senator Pete Domenici had also heard of these aerial concerns from Paul Bennewitz near military bases, as well as strange mutilations occurring across the nation, and finally decided to do something about it. It was Domenici's actions that caused the Air Force's Special Weapons Lab to budge and provide an answer instead of feigning ignorance of everything. Additionally, because of Paul Bennewitz's crazed letters to Senator Domenici, the senator was able to assist Officer Valdez thereafter with additional resources like Geiger counters and new information that would provide a few more pieces to the puzzle. If it's not obvious, these aircraft were owned by entities like the CIA, NSA, the Air Force, the Department of Energy, and a slew of military contractors in the US. They're not aliens flying around military bases without clearance. Honestly, if we broke down the situation Paul presented as a concern to the government in his many letters at the time, we would quickly conclude that the US government and military would never stand to have any foreign entity in their airspace without their permission, if there was. Rest assured that radar systems would have been extensively tracking these craft, and numerous fighter jets, along with ground-to-air missiles, would have been rapidly dispatched to confront any unwanted guests. Even if American technology was no match for whatever was flying around the skies at the time, one thing I know for sure is that the US military was highly defensive of its homeland as it pertained to foreign invaders, or at least that's how it used to be during the 20th century. The fact that no one in a position of military authority took Paul's alien theories seriously should be an obvious giveaway that the Air Force was already well aware of these lights and craft. Exactly how aware? Well, on multiple occasions after Doty and Bennewitz had met, Paul had been given tours of Kirtland Air Force Base, where he had photographed more images of experimental craft that looked just like UFOs. Colonel Ernest Edwards is thought to be one of the people identified in Paul's images during this tour of the base. Additionally, Paul would be flown around Dulce's Mount Archuleta in Army helicopters, where Doty and a few others would dispel more classified information to Paul that would eventually lead him to his desire to meet other investigators like Gabe Valdez. Paul, after being shown a significant amount of advanced technology under the guise that it was all alien-derived, became intrigued with learning how everything operated and what each of their purposes were. Many people think that Paul was only shown one kind of craft or two, but I believe that he was privy to documenting and observing several kinds of craft that ranged in size, function, and purpose. The bottom line is that after Bennewitz was told a multitude of things that many believe were classified, it led Paul to return back to Dulce with his own plane and even a news crew at one point in an attempt to document more evidence of these bizarre craft that he became so obsessed with. Of course, he was able to photograph these crafts further around the Dulce area, even in the daytime. Yet, finding all the images he took can range from slightly challenging to impossible. And I'm finding this to be a common theme regarding this subject and the internet. Nevertheless, I do appreciate the people out there who have taken the time to preserve these images you see on open source platforms for all of us to still appreciate all these years later.